when I was in school, we discussed, are there any lessons we learned from history? A man named Voltaire, a French philosopher, a couple of years ago said the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from it. I think that sometimes there are lessons to be learned from history. And the kids of my day, a lot of them would have the attitude, why study history? That's all. Well, without history, you don't know who you are, where you came from, and oftentimes then you don't know where you're going. Yes?
It seems like history always repeats itself. Like we always go into
Most of the time, it's because we didn't learn it for the first time. And I mean, how many students at this school know that the Tang Dynasty took land from the rich and redistributed among the poor, and the whole thing came crashing down? How many of them know that, or even care? How many of them know that the Song Dynasty was a socialistic dynasty, and both dynasties tried to help the poor through government programs? And that both dynasties came crashing down. How many of the students here are aware of that? Probably none. Again, your average Joe voter anymore doesn't even, so many of them don't even know for sure who George Washington was. I mean, or why we fought the war for independence, and why do we celebrate the 4th of July? I mean, we have a reason for that, folk. All right. Now, anyway, but eventually, though, the Chinese did become a little bit more urban. They began to make steel. Oh yeah, under the Song Dynasty, steel and cotton was processed. Now, I don't want to say they invented cotton, but they learned how to grow cotton and use cotton. Again, a lot of these things, the China. Now, steel, that is something else. Steel is made primarily of iron, but you mix with magnesium. And the question you might have, well, how much iron and magnesium depends on what you want the steel to do. There's structural steel used in making bridges and skyscrapers, or there's steel that will bend and give when it's hit, like they use in automobiles, because if the car has a crash, you want it to give a little bit and absorb a lot of the shock. So there's steel that can be used as springs. So again, depending on what you want to use it for. And also there are other elements that's involved in it. So it's iron mixed with other elements and heated to a certain temperature. And very important because steel is lighter than iron, and it's also stronger than iron, and can be used in places where that iron can be used to do things that are much better than iron can. These inventions the Chinese made should have propelled them to the top of the world. Instead, they taught these things to other people, most notably Western Europeans, and the Western Europeans wound up going in and largely taking over China, using some of the same things that the Chinese had invented. Now, the Silk Road, oh yes, before getting so the Chinese set up banks. They issued paper money. I think I've told you this before, but folks, without banks, you cannot build airplanes. Or you might build something like the Wright brothers did, but I'm talking about building a commercial jet airliner, building a military heavy transport plane, or building a military fighter plane like the F-22 or the F-15. You have to have an economy, banking. I mean, those workers who are doing the work in building the plane have to have somebody else grow the food. It has to be an economic system. Paper money. As recently, as 200 years ago, one of our presidents, James Madison, was against paper money. He said it contributes to inflation. Some of that is true. But again, what he didn't realize, and I'd like to go back and say, hey, how do you pay 30,000 workers in gold and silver coins? And if you don't know the answer, I don't either. Lockheed paid us, and at first with checks, then they just simply paid us by transferring our pay to our local bank. And it was done electronically. But again, without paper money, you cannot have a complex economy. And James Madison, who wrote our Constitution, did not realize this. Paper money was fought against for a long time. But transform yourself to the 20th century and 21st century. Well, hey, without it, you simply cannot have things like railroads, big industry, workers being paid by thousands of workers working in one place. You simply can't do it with gold and silver coins. For one thing, there's not enough gold and silver to go around. There still was a Silk Road. The Silk Road was to last for more than millennia, and it ran between China and the Mediterranean world. But most of the Silk Road, though, at this time, did not send goods directly from China to the Mediterranean. Most of the Silk Road went to the Muslim world. And at this time in history, I'm talking about the 10, 1100s, and 1200s, the Muslim world was far ahead of Europe economically. Europe was out of gold and silver. The Muslim world had it. So most of the trade with China was trade between China and the Islamic world, close to the Mediterranean. Now, trade was dangerous. The mountains were often difficult to cross. There were a lot of deserts. But the worst problem was bandits. And that's why the Chinese eventually resorted to sea trade. It is known, or it is believed, that the Chinese built wooden vessels that were 450 feet long. Now, bring this up because the Ark of Noah was made out of wood, and it was 450 feet long. There have been persons that it's impossible to build a wooden vessel 450 feet long. Well, the Chinese claim that they did it, and as for the only thing we have as proof, we found one rudder that was on one of those ships, and the rudder would have been a rudder that would have only been used for a 450 foot long vessel. But they claim that they built 450 foot long vessels. The wood they used was teak. They take this teak wood, of course, cut the tree down, then bury it several feet underground and cover it over several years. When they got it up, the teak wood would be extremely hard. And in fact, it was a type of pressure treating, treating the lumber. And this teak would be extremely hard, and they could then put it together and build their sailing vessels. It is known that some of their sailing vessels came to California a few years before Columbus did. Again, these people were on the verge of bursting out of their seams and overspreading the whole globe. Well, what happened? Their philosophers stepped in. They're philosophers. I mean, the Chinese emperors were more likely to consult their philosophers than were European kings. The philosophers told the kings that paper money promotes greed. Paper money also promotes inflation. And the banks promote even more greed. We have to avoid greed. Therefore, the emperors closed the banks, destroyed the paper money, and let the wooden ships that they built rot until the day there's, like I say, one rudder. We found one rudder, but otherwise we don't have them. They're lost, probably all sunk in the ocean somewhere, pretty deep. The ocean waters around that area are really, really deep in places. As far as going to California, now, all right, keep in mind, the trip from China to California is 10,000 miles. The trip from Europe to the New World, I mean to the islands, was only about 4,000 miles. So you're talking about more than twice as far. But the Chinese had no interest in settling in California, no interest in leaving. Now, that changed later. In the 18 and 1900s, the Chinese came to California, came to Jamaica, came to Latin America in droves. But that was in the 18 and 1900s, 1700s even. But at this time, the Chinese had no interest in leaving their comfort of their own home territory. Besides, California was not a good place to grow rice. I mean, you know, if that's all they knew how to grow in California. Now, we do have places in this country, particularly in South Georgia, that do make for good rice growing, but California was not a good place for that. So the Chinese did not show much interest. But bandits forced a lot of these merchants to hire troops to go with them. But sea trade became larger, became popular. Silk, porcelain, all right. Now that's silk, that's something interesting. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. European women really got to liking silk, and they'd buy it, and of course, keep in mind, by the Chinese could produce it, then it would go to another middleman, and another middleman, and another middleman. By the time it got to Europe, only the higher nobility women could afford it, the wealthier women. But they often said, if we only in Europe knew what kind of tree they grow this from, and no, okay, silk is not grown from a tree. Silk was grown from a certain kind of worm, the silkworm. Now we know that. And eventually the secret got out, and it really hurt the Chinese economy. But the Chinese, as long as they had this secret, of the silkworm, it helped their economy greatly. But eventually Europeans learned how to grow the silkworm and grow silk themselves. But that was to come a lot later. Porcelain, you might not know, porcelain is used a lot in electronics as an insulator between the electrolytes and the capacitors. Now, if any of you know what I'm talking about, you can raise your hand. Yeah, a capacitor has two, I'm calling electrolytes, two plates. And but to insulate the two plates, often they use porcelain. Very good insulator. But porcelain was used in teacups, dishes, things like this. Silk used for clothing. Tea, oh yes, tea, a big one. Eventually Europeans learned how to grow tea themselves, but that was something the Chinese for a while had a monopoly on. Now folk, again, the things that these people had, I mean, they were just a step away, but it stopped. It stopped. But they were a step away from bursting out and really, really going places. There were things that they got from the South Seas, places like Indonesia. They got these precious stones, grapes, walnuts, pomegranates that they got from the South Sea that they also distributed to the Muslim world. I don't know how they preserved some of these fruits like pomegranates, but they managed. China had a bunch of what you call new people or landed gentry. This is something that most societies eventually get. New, rich, would often replace the old nobility. Folk, a lot of times, persons who have a lot of money lose it. And persons who have little money gain a whole lot. And, all right, back in 1900, someone wrote a book about the 400 richest families in America at that time that said within 100 years, by 2000, these rich families will control the whole country. They'll have all the wealth, practically all of it. 100 years went by and somebody did some research, and of these 400 families, only about 2 of them were still rich. The other 398 or so families had lost all their wealth, and their wealth was only a distant memory. And I've heard that the Kennedy family is about to lose most of their wealth because they don't know how to get it the way their grandfather, Joseph P. Kennedy, got it. Or they can't get it the same way he got it, so they have to find some other way. But they're about to lose their wealth also. The wealth tends to, most famous case is the Borgia family that came from Spain, and one of them even became a pope within a couple generations afterwards. Pope Alexander VI, I'm talking about. Within a couple generations, the Borgia family were in poverty. And their one descendant they had left knocked on the door of the King of France and said, "Hi, my name is Borgia." The King of France felt sorrow, gave him 100 ducats and sent him away. This was all, and that's the last we hear of the Borgia family. At one time, though, they were super rich. So by the way, the one who became pope paid for it out of his own pockets, bought it. I mean, this went on. And, all right. Now, so new gentry came up. The gentry could move up and down the economic ladder. the basic unit of Chinese life was and remained to this day the family. And by family, I mean extended family. In other words, if you and your first cousins, the second cousins, if you came from the same great-great-grandparents, you were considered part of the same family. And oftentimes you lived in a village. Now, this is something that I think most of you have heard, but female babies were oftentimes killed in time of famine because females were not looked on very highly in China. Again, folks, for those of you who are women, this is straight out of the book. And believe me, in no way do I agree with it. I mean, personally, I have 2 daughters myself and 1 son. But anyway, in time of famine, to keep from having an extra mouth to feed, they'd oftentimes get rid of their female babies. Now, this went on in the 20th century also, when the government made a law that is now off the books. But the government made a law that no couple could have more than 2 children. Well, if the Chinese wanted to have a child to carry on a family name, and girls didn't, so they killed the female babies. A generation of men grew up who couldn't find wives. How many of you have heard this now from outside? Okay, several of you have heard this. Yeah, okay. So the reason I had you raise your hand, I want you to know that I'm not making it up, folk. I mean, this is actual serious history. But now, in recent years, about 4 or 5 years, the Chinese government eliminated the practice, and today the Chinese couples are encouraged to let their female babies grow up also. But this actually went on, and also now I was told by a student from India, your book does mention that the people in India often did this too. It wasn't just the Chinese, but the Indian people also, the Indian Indians. Or females were oftentimes sold as concubines or hired out as domestic servants. So as far as hiring them out as domestic servants, I mean, that's the norm. I mean, my 2 daughters both have jobs now, so basically they're hired out, but not as sex slaves. Now, here's something else. Now, I recently read something other than what your book says on this, practice of foot binding. When I was a kid, we saw some pictures of Chinese women who had their foot, now, foot binding, let me define it first. It means you take a female baby and put her in a shoe that is so small that her feet were not allowed to grow. And she grows up crippled. Now this practice was eliminated when the communists took over in 1950, but in some places in the countryside it still went on. And the authors of your book say that when they visited China in the 1980s, they saw some women whose feet had been bound, but most of them now are deceased, died of old age. So you don't see that much anymore. But your book says the idea was to make them look more attractive to males. Now, I had a young pupil say one time, and he was an American man, he said, I don't find crippled women attractive. I said, well, I don't either, but then again, we're just trained to expect that women can walk on their own 2 feet, but the Chinese expected their women. Yeah.
There is only 10 women left in those.
How many?
10.
10 left? Okay. I heard they were about dying out. But, anyway, but also I heard something else recently, that the purpose was not so much to make the women look more attractive. Well, okay, the foot binding changed the shape of their legs, which made the women more attractive during the sex act, supposedly. That's as much as I want to say about that. But also it kept the women from running off. All right. This is what this article I read said, that the idea was that some women would try to run off. So the foot binding was to make sure that they stayed put. And that it crippled them to where they could not leave, as well as change the shape of their legs. Now, there's one Western custom we have that might most closely resemble it. It is the practice of wearing high-heeled shoes. Now, I have a wife and 2 daughters. One of the daughters still lives at home. And I don't know that they ever wore high heels. It's out of style and out of fashion, and it's a good thing because high heels led to problems with ingrown toenails, corns, bunions, plantar warts, fallen arches. I hope none of you have any idea what I'm talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then you're blessed. I've had ingrown toenail surgery 4 times on 4 different parts of my toes.
You wear heels?
Only on the weekends.
What?
What?
Well, let's see. Anyway, no, so,
Wash your feet.
well,
No, that's not how it works.
anyway, but we have led to all these foot problems.
It's shape.
Fallen arches also, whatever. But again, I don't think that the women of America were wearing high heels as much as they once did. I don't see it very often.
They do.
They do? Okay. I don't see it. Of course, maybe I'm not looking for it. But my wife does not have any high heels, and as far as I know, my daughters don't either. Now, the one daughter has moved out. I don't know what she's wearing, but anyway. I once asked my mother, why do you women wear high heels? And she said, oh, it's to make the women's ankles more slender. And basically, that's what she told me, to make the women more attractive to the men and making their ankles a little bit more slender. And it made them a little bit taller than they actually were also. Made them appear taller, all this stuff. All right, go ahead and laugh. But hey, believe me, when I was a youngster, high heels were very, very, very much in style. And so was ingrown toenails and fallen arches and plantar warts and the whole bit. Corns, oh yeah, I hope none of you know what a
I
corn
like
is.
feet, but not like.
And a bunion, I hope none of you know what any of that is. So if you don't know what it is, say, don't ask, you're blessed.
Still, there's a lot of people I've seen, Jamaicans, Africans, they wear shoes smaller than their feet.
They probably have problems with their feet
Yeah,
also.
Say one looks, if they have those big
Yeah.
feet and then one looks small.
Yeah, well, they probably have foot problems
For
also.
real.
Big feet is
All right, anyway, we'll leave that.
True.
Now, occasionally, all right, this practice of foot binding was to continue up until the communist government outlawed it, but even the communists could not reach deep into the countryside. The communists took over in 1949, the year I was born, and one of the first acts was to outlaw that practice. And in the big cities, of course, the laws could be enforced. But I think, again, there's only supposedly 10 women left who've done it.
They broke.
I've never seen it.
They broke their feet so they could fit small shoes. That's kind of.
I didn't know that, but anyway. But hey, I'll tell you something now. When the Chinese Communist government outlawed it, guess who protested the most? It was the women themselves and not the men who protested it. It was the women, the older women said, well, that's not feminine. Why, you can't be a woman unless you have small feet. It was the women who protested it, and they were the ones who, you might think they'd have been glad it happened. Of course, I'm sure that today's Chinese women don't want it, but their grandmas fought against the practice. Now, a few women gained real high prominence, and one woman in China became impressed. I'm not going to write her name down, but the way these women would take charge, and this happened, by the way, in the late 1800s, a woman took charge, and she's blamed with destroying China. But they would marry the emperor, they'd have a child. When the emperor died, often young, the child was too young to become emperor himself, so the wife would take over, or the mother would take over, and they would crown the new, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old child as emperor, but the mother would take over and run the show from behind the scenes. And a few women became prominent that way, by being at the right place at the right time, but it was a lot of chance.